really lovely to be here and to be able to come speak somewhere where you don't have to take a plane to it is especially nice. I have to tell you that whenever I'm introduced, I think of my favorite credentialing story, and this happened to me the morning after I won the Pulitzer. I opened up the New York Times, and in the Times they had these little pictures of all of us, and under my picture it said that I had graduated from college summa cum laude. And I thought it was very nice of the New York Times to give me a summa since Radcliffe had neglected to. So I wrote a letter to the managing editor of the Times thanking him very much for my summa, and he sent me back a note saying, "Oh, it's our pleasure. You are now the first person in American history to have won a Pulitzer and a summa on the same day." So I am really here as a fellow traveler through a transition that all of you are either in or at least thinking about. In January, I bowed out of my extremely long career as a columnist and have been moving on to what is, I suspect, the first of many encores. Civic Ventures, and now all of you here are using this slogan, then, semicolon, now, with an emphasis on the semicolon. And I have often thought that if I were Victor Borges, I could do a verbal rendition of that semicolon. But as a writer, I can only say that semicolons interest me because they are the grammatical way that we pause, the way we take a deep breath and then move on. What interests me today about the meeting is that there's a moment when people of a certain age can, maybe even should, stop what we have been doing and take a deep breath. There's a moment when we give ourselves permission to plan, to look around, to take a bow, even to bow out, and yet also look for this encore. I love the phrase encore careers. It's a great and rich idea, particularly since it sounds so theatrical. There are all sorts of echoes. Life is a stage. We are always, always in a stage of life. The words are full of showmanship and of applause, but in fact, there may not be all that many ticket holders in the public audience applauding and begging those of us over 55 or 60 for another song. So people like us are creating our own encores, not just for ourselves and not even just for our causes, but also, if you will forgive me, for our country. That's what we're about here, and that's what I want to reflect on with all of you. As a graduate of the women's movement, I keep recalling the 1970s movement slogan, "The personal is political." Today, as we talk together about engaging in encore careers, we are, of course, really embarked on another huge social change where the personal is political. How to look at aging. How to live meaningful lives as older people. In the double helix of social change, there is a deep relationship between the goals of changing our own lives as we age and changing the country. The huge thing, I don't have to tell this group, is that we're embarked on a wholesale transformation in the way we understand and live out the extraordinary revolution in longevity. In the last century, the average American lifespan has grown up by 30 years. In 1900, the typical American lived to be 47. Today, the typical American lives to be 78. And if you are 65, you have a 50-50 chance of living to be 90. There are about 60 million Americans over 55 today, and in another quarter century, there will be 100 million. We know about this in terms of numbers, arithmetic, but we haven't really absorbed this fact emotionally. Senior is now a word that encompasses both the people who fought in World War II and the people who were born in World War II. A huge age span. Last year we witnessed a sorry kind of example of this age span in the case of the philanthropist, Brooke Astor, who died at age 104, and her own son, Anthony Marshall, was convicted of defrauding her, but it's a story in which the son was 85 years old. What to say, too, about the Prince of Wales? The baby boomer still waiting to take over the family business at 62. We created the term senior for a much shorter lifespan. We don't exactly know how to redefine senior. Seniors indeed seem to be more defined by their entitlements or their demands or their needs than the social expectations of them as contributors. And we by no means know what senior citizenship means. Longevity is often talked about in policy circles as the problem that has no name, the very same phrase that Betty Friedan used when she described the feminine mystique. But this time it's quite literally true. Americans coined the term adolescence to describe the lifespan between childhood and adulthood. We have yet to coin a phrase, a single phrase, for the sometimes uncertain transitions of active age, for the semicolon. But we also belong to the generation who have been the change agents of our culture throughout our lives. We led the civil rights movement, we led the women's movement, we led the gay rights movement. We are the pro-change generation. And of course, well, all of these revolutions have been personal and political. And it is no surprise that if we have one more revolution left in us, it's because it's going to be around age, around redefining age in society. We will redefine it together through how we live it and how we contribute. We don't have a label yet to describe the early active aging, but we are reinventing ourselves and society's expectations just as we have throughout our lives. So we are again in transition, both a personal and a political one. In the semicolon, we have to pause to recalculate the purpose of our longer lives and the purpose of any longer life as individuals and, yes, as a collective. But let me start with a smaller story. When I retired from the column after 4 decades, my daughter told my grandson this, and he promptly called me up and said, "Grandma, I hear you're tired." Well, after putting my hand on the phone so you wouldn't hear my hysterical laughter, I said, well, not exactly. In fact, I had a great deal of trouble with the word retirement, that swoon of a word. I think we all have trouble describing a closing without an ending. We need to come up with a much better word. Retirement won't do, and rewirement, we'll see. When I began thinking about closing out the column, the phrase that was running around in my head was the phrase, "I'm letting myself go." Now, I love this phrase because it has such negative connotations. If you all walked out and told your friends, Ellen Goodman is letting herself go, I assure you that this would bring up all kinds of bad images. Lazy, fat, out of shape, we won't go there. The absolute worst thing that you can say about a woman of a certain age. But I loved the idea of reclaiming that phrase. After all, where do you go when you let yourself go? To allow this phrase to run around the free spaces between deadlines in my life for the year or two before I made this decision was quite liberating. It suggested the freedom that could fuel this journey And in all honesty, it also echoed the old definition of freedom. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Last December, when I sat down with my editors at the Washington Post for what I referred to as the sheet cake lunch, one of them pulled out a column that I had written 3 decades ago. And he read to me, "There's a trick to the graceful exit. It begins with a vision to recognize when a job, a life stage, a relationship is over and to let go. It means leaving what's over without denying its validity or its past importance in our lives. It involves a sense of the future, a belief that every exit line is an entry, that we are moving on rather than out. The trick of retiring well may be the trick of living well," he read back to me. "It's hard to recognize that life isn't a holding action, but a process. It's hard to learn that we don't leave the best parts of ourselves behind, back in the dugout or the office. We own what we learned out there. The experience and the growth are grafted onto our lives, and when we exit, we can take ourselves along quite gracefully." Well, I was pretty astonished to hear, let alone find myself heeding my 40-something-year-old self. But I am aware, as most of you are, of exactly how long that little rumble, that little thought about what happens next begins in our own brains. In my own transition, it seems that I have become something of what Civic Ventures would call a social entrepreneur, although I'm not sure that I feel comfortable with that phrase. Even before leaving the column, I had begun helping to bring together a group of care providers, clergy, social workers, and media people who are trying to jumpstart a movement to normalize conversations about end of life. We call ourselves the Conversation Project. From both my professional interest in bioethics and my personal experience with my mother's death and others, I had become very aware of the tremendous disconnect between the way we want to live our last days and the way we are, in fact, living them. So this alternative to reinventing and re-engaging in the third act is the expansion of retirees exercising me-first politics. Its elders told that their only social responsibility is to not be financially dependent. As we make our own encore decisions, one by one, we also and collectively are part of the solution or of the problem. For this moment, we are our own mentors. The problem and the gift of longevity will be solved by the people who name it and wrestle with it and who invent age, reinvent age. I don't want to suggest that the transition, the pause, the semicolon between now and what's next is easy, either for individual people or for our country. In fact, it's a very tall order, every bit as demanding as the other movements that we have been so much a part of. When I think of the daunting task of reinvention, reinventing myself, all of us reinventing our lives and reinventing our country, and reinventing the idea of age, I am reminded of the Beat Generation poet Jack Kerouac, who once said that gave us probably the guidepost for all of you in the new millennium when he said, "Walking on water wasn't built in a day." Thank you.